I'm Fredrik and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
You are the advocate. Well, summer series. This is our summer series, Leilani. Are you proud of being a part of a summer series?
It's great to have a summer series. It's not exactly light fare all the time, though, our summer series.
Oh.
We're in kleptocracy and capitalist communist China and what next, Fredrik? I don't know. And you were filming recently in my hemisphere.
I was out filming for my new project. I was in West Virginia, one of the poorest states in the United States, and a state that is producing a lot of oil, coal, gas, like Nigeria or Angola or Russia or other countries where the people suffer and the money just floats out. So West Virginia in some way also mirrors that kind of economy, the extractive economies.
Yeah.
Very sweet people out there. Of course, they might have a reason to be suspicious to documentary filmmakers. Somebody said, "Oh, you're here to make fun of us." Well, not really, but it's interesting.
Yeah.
I met with Sarah Chase, who we've actually had here in our podcast. Sarah wrote this book about corruption in America, so I wanted to follow up on her. But I also met a very sweet teacher who was part of leading a teacher strike a few years ago, because the public money is starving, so they try to cut the health policies of the teachers and other people who work in school, which is like horrible.
Terrible.
But overall, a very beautiful state. So forests and extremely beautiful place.
Sounds amazing.
I was happy to be there. But today we're going to dive into our summer series, and we talked to a friend of yours and mine in London, Anna Minton. So tell me about Anna Minton.
Well, Anna Minton is well known for having written a book called Big Capital about the financialization of housing in London, and an amazing and succinct book that certainly provoked a lot of conversations and was highly regarded. And she's a big thinker on big things.
So we called her to talk about the release of the Pandora Papers. So that's like, there is this kind of conglomerate of investigative journalists around Europe and also with the US connection, that they help to sort out leaked material that they get. And every time there is a leak like that, we can see patterns. We can see how the most powerful operate in many ways, and it's always quite upsetting. But already then, when we did this, we talked about why doesn't these leaks change more than they do? How do you see that, Leilani?
It is amazing. I sometimes wonder if it just seems all so far away and hard to the amount of money that we're talking about that travels afar, the fact that it's sort of in the air, there's something intangible about it. I think it seems really big to people, and yet it's having such a immediate effect on people around the world. I mean, kleptocracy, right?
And Sarah Chase that I mentioned, she talks about kleptocracy as also as a network.
Yes.
Of kind of interlinked in many ways, and she also talked about the hydra. If you cut off a head of a hydra, a new will grow back somewhere else. So it's in some way, when those leaks are taking down one or two politicians or one or two oligarchs somewhere, the system will just keep going. So if we really want to change the system, we need to look much deeper into the structure and the patterns of this. And that's actually something I'm trying to do. But let's listen to Anna to see what she thinks about the Pandora Papers and why we see this coming up over and over again?
You know, the news breaks, it takes over The Guardian, it's front of the BBC for a couple of days. And yet we have this feeling that it's nothing new. Actually, this is the third mega leak of this kind. First of all, we had the Panama Papers, then we had the Paradise Papers, and now it's the Pandora Papers. And every time it comes out, there's a lot of shock and noise, and it's appalling, and some high-profile politicians and public figures are shamed and embarrassed. And then sometimes there are government noises that, actually we're going to do something about this, as happened particularly after the Panama Papers. David Cameron had a big conference to regulate, what was going on in London, and he was going to shine a light, etc., and actually nothing happened, and the legislation that the Conservative government had put into place, it never came on to the statute books. So what's concerning for me is that actually, these revelations come out again and again, and they'll come out again, and each time they are, if anything, more shocking. The latest revelations in the Pandora Papers are about so many high-profile politicians and, heads of state and huge donors to the British Conservative Party, and yet not much happens. And sad to say, in London, I think that in the current political context, it's even less likely to happen in our post-Brexit context, where every indication from the government has been actually that the City of London wishes to be, to use a euphemism, more competitive than before, by which they mean actually they're going to continue to try to attract this kind of money. And I mean, of course, Britain is a huge player behind this wealth industry. The majority of companies linked to the Pandora Papers, 2/3 of companies, of I think 956 companies which were exposed, 2/3 of those actually are in the British Virgin Islands. So British offshore tax havens and the City of London itself actually right at the centre of all of this.
Because at every leak we talk about the names that drop out. And this time it was the biggest thing was, of course, the Tony and Sherry Blair, who didn't do anything criminal, but they bought a company in the British Virgin Islands, which then that was like a house following with it. And as we saw in Push, there is a lot of houses in London owned from tax havens where you don't really know who owns them, and many of them stand empty. That's something we showed in Push, which of course means it's kind of insane to see. But we talk a little bit about these big names, but we don't talk so much about is the wealth management industry. So I think I'm happy that you mentioned it, because London, also in Push we had Roberto Saviano, and he said London is the capital of criminal money. It's like that's where it is the biggest tax haven of all in some way, because it's also most of the tax havens are run from London. The lawyers, the accountants, and all these people. So do you think that we're again missing to look into those kind of the facilitators?
Absolutely. And not only that, wealth management, it's actually high status. To say that you work in wealth management is not considered to be in any sense a dirty word. If you were to say I work for an offshore tax haven, eyebrows might be raised. But wealth management brings with it a whole different host of associations. So I think, the mainstream perception of wealth management is that it's a really positive thing. It's really good that London and the UK are at the centre of this, multi-billion pound industry. It's bringing capital into the country, and that's going to benefit the rest of the city, the rest of the country. Of course, it doesn't work like that at all. That's a complete fallacy that this money actually will be distributed in an equitable fashion. It doesn't work remotely like that. But actually, there's a misconception about what wealth management is, and that it is essentially the servicing of offshore tax havens, secretive anonymous companies, with well, as you say, criminal money, that it's at the centre of a huge money laundering operation.
Yeah, I mean, I find it quite fascinating that the UK, which I come from a Commonwealth country. We look to the mother country for all sorts of things. We have a common law system, just like the UK. The UK is always sort of, seems so proper. And to think that it's become this, not just itself, basically the facilitator of all of this corrupt flow of corrupt capital, but other markets emulate the same thing that the UK does. So Singapore and other countries use that very same model and structures to allow for this flow of capital. So, it's kind of like, like a contradiction to me that the UK, that, with all of its long history of law, would be at the center of all of this. I don't know if you can explain that to us.
I think in simple terms, the image of the City of London and the UK and the rule of law, in the mid-1980s, a lot of this was simply swept away. Deregulation and Big Bang in 1986, which was the deregulation of the financial markets, it created a completely new city. And at the foundations of this actually were that we would be a very low tax and deregulated economy with a big emphasis on a shift to privatized services. So actually, regulation from that point on became a dirty word. Get rid of all regulation that you can. A bonfire of regulations is a kind of conservative mantra. So when you get rid of regulation, regulation isn't a dirty word. It's actually very closely linked with the rule of law. When you get rid of regulations, you create a fertile climate for this Wild West sort of environment that grew up in the City of London from the late 80s onwards. So I think, we can also be too nostalgic about, upright notions of Britishness and fair play. I'm sure that, there were always sort of questions to be asked, through our contentious imperial legacy. But from the mid-80s onwards, actually a very, very new culture was created, which was all about getting rid of regulation and bringing in as much capital as we possibly could.
But isn't the story also that a lot of people with money, kleptocrats, people with a lot of money from Nigeria, from any, basically stealing money from their own people, that they move money into London because they feel safer. They feel that their money is more protected, just because it is a very stable legal system. So you have all this influx of Russian money, and I now saw that the Saudi crown prince is buying Newcastle Football Club, and it was just like, it's, again, this flow of money into your country, money that should make its job in the home country, but it's actually shipped out because they feel safer.
Absolutely. Yeah, they feel safer. It's got this reputation, it's the place of choice for essentially very large scale money laundering. And the aspect that we haven't talked about so much yet is actually that this money goes into purchasing very, very expensive, super prime, very desirable property in the most expensive parts of London. And the London property market is one of the most expensive property markets in the world. And, this money is having a disproportionate impact actually on property and housing throughout the city and throughout the country as a whole. But actually the property assets in themselves in London are very, very desirable. And they will retain their value because of the structure of the property market in the UK.
And this has a severe effect for people in the town.
Oh, well, it absolutely does. So, I mean, the whole sort of the myth around creating an economy which is going to attract capital from, perfectly upstanding as well as nefarious sources, that's based on that Reaganomics notion of trickle down. Surely it's a good thing to bring in lots of money. Surely it's a good thing to be the destination and the residence of choice for the largest number of ultra high net worth individuals and billionaires in the world. That's London today, and the argument is, well, that can only be a good thing. They're bringing their money, they're bringing their spending power, they're creating, knock-on effects. But actually, this wealth doesn't trickle down as the narrative assures us that it will, and benefit the poorer parts of the city and the lower income parts of the city. It does trickle down, but it displaces existing communities by raising property prices and rental prices and ensuring that lower income communities who originally lived there can no longer afford to do so. So they get moved out of the central parts of London to the periphery. And even now from the periphery, we're seeing, very many families, many of whom I know, actually. I live in a zone 3 part of London, which is, it's not exactly a suburb, but it's not inner London, and lots of people I know who have children like I do, who work in decent jobs but not especially high earning jobs, can no longer afford to live in London. So they move out to seaside towns, perhaps like Margate or Hastings, or other cities like Bristol and Cardiff. And therefore you experience those same pressures in those other towns and cities. So it's a whole domino effect, actually, around the country. So trickle down, yes, trickle down does indeed trickle down, but not at all in a beneficial way, in a way where it enhances the pre-existing inequalities.
Leilani, your dear brother-in-law is a minister in the UK government, and he was for a long time also the housing minister. So, and I guess you at the family gatherings also talked about politics. What is their argument for keeping this system up? You must have had this many times.
You'd be surprised, actually, how steadfastly families can avoid controversial conversations. I'm fairly adept at doing that myself, I must say, so that I can actually enjoy my meal and my wine. That being said, I mean, I can't say what my brother-in-law's justification might have been when he was housing minister, but I have heard from members of the Conservative Party in the UK that, some countries export bananas, some countries export laptop computers, and other countries export finance and property. And the UK happens to be the latter. And, it goes to what Anna was saying. I mean, it's this false narrative that it brings capital in, that it makes the country stronger with all this money flowing in, when as Anna said, it's just not true, and there isn't a trickle down. And even when I, as rapporteur, would sit across, now I didn't do this in the UK, but I sat across many ministries of finance and budgeting, and I would ask them, could you please explain to me how is this productive money? Like, how does this generate anything in your economy? I was often met with blank stares. They couldn't even explain back to me how it would benefit the person that I'm meeting living in abject poverty, homelessness, or even just, kind of crappy housing on the outskirts of a city.
Or students,
or et cetera. They couldn't explain it. And one of the things that I don't think people understand with these huge amounts of money, I'm often told by people who are really wedded to neoliberalism. Well, it's just the market, and nothing these guys, mostly guys, are doing, not only guys, but nothing they're doing is actually illegal. It might not be in the, in quote, spirit of the law, but, using tax havens isn't illegal, and buying properties that are for sale is not illegal. Sure. But first of all, when they buy properties, they're not actually buying it at market rate. Often the house might be up for £20 million and they'll buy it for £50 million because it's $50 million that they're trying to hide or get rid of or not pay taxes on. And that is a clear distortion of any market insofar as a market exists, right? Those sorts of things, people don't talk about that this isn't just sort of some normal real estate transaction. There's a whole thing going on here that's quite other.
Which is money laundering.
Yeah.
Is this a pedagogical problem, Anna, to explain to people? Why are people not more angry about this? Why doesn't it really... we mentioned now it's the third time we see this happening, and if you look at some London neighborhoods, traditional neighborhoods, they are totally emptied by people now. So it's just this money floating in.
Yeah, and I think just to come back to Leilani's point about these astronomical prices that you see, which actually are for the purpose of putting the dirty money somewhere. Those ridiculous prices are then greeted in British newspapers with headlines saying, most expensive penthouse apartment ever sold for, 80 million, as if this is some really, really positive thing. So it's the narrative, it is the strength of the rhetoric that we've been sold, which is the high prices and the influx of lots of money, regardless of where it comes from, is a really positive thing for our economy. And that's the narrative we've lived with since the 1980s. What can we do about that? Well, we need to talk about it in different terms. And while I think that the Pandora Papers and the Paradise Papers and the Panama Papers, they have done incredible work, because they're focused on the specifics quite often of, anonymous companies and tax deals. And it's quite complicated to sort of, understand some of these structures. It's deliberately extremely complicated. And the sort of the fun bits in this story are hearing about, whatever celebrity or famous person has been caught up in the scandal. But with regard to the framing of the story, it's not presented, I would argue, actually in the right way. It's not presented as a money laundering scandal. Actually, it's presented as, people avoiding tax and, some very famous people caught up in that. When really, what we're talking about is a far, far murkier and more problematic picture.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think people have a hard time getting their head around this stuff in a way that then can be mobilized on the streets in a certain way. Although, I suppose Occupy Wall Street was kind of related to an outrage around this. One of the things that I think also, Anna, that doesn't get talked about enough is I think the figure is something like $600 billion every year is lost in lost taxes every year, that sort of globally, through the use of tax havens. And from a human rights point of view, what we say through human rights is that governments have to use all of their available resources to address deprivations, whether it's housing deprivation, health deprivation, education, etc. And if they're allowing this tax base to just leave the country and find themselves in some island somewhere and then eventually into a property in the UK, they are not doing what they're supposed to do legally under international human rights law, which is to get those taxes and use those taxes in a constructive way that actually benefits the vast majority of the population. But I think these are, guesstimates $600 billion, but I think that needs to be talked about more. What are the real losses here beyond just the pressures on the market and the skewing of the market? What are the tangible losses?
I think it's also, for me, it's like a break of the social contract, because the rest of us, we pay taxes. So there's a lot of people who have to pay taxes, and then they don't. So it also destroys society in some way.
Well, I completely agree with what you're saying. And I mean, I think what I want to say sort of very much links with that, which is actually it's about a reframing of tax. Tax is another of those words which, doesn't really have very much traction. In the media, tax I think that the idea of Amazon and, huge corporates like that paying more tax has started to gain more traction. But generally, politically, all governments are trying to outdo each other, especially the British government, around, how low taxes can remain. And the media narrative around tax is it's not a populist one, to say the least. It's quite similar to regulation. And I think tax has to be framed in a really, really different way. It's not about tax. It's about, as you say, Fredrik, the social contract and whether or not we want to have a social contract, because the consequence of not paying tax in this way is to destroy our social contract. But it's about the framing of it. And, as a former journalist and someone who is still involved in journalism to some degree, the media, and especially the UK media, has an enormous role to play in how all the issues that we've been talking about today are framed or misframed.
Yeah. Language, Leilani, we talked a lot about that language is important, and Anna, now you're lifting out a lot of very good examples of that. So we need to reframe our language and win the language to be able to also to win this debate. You mentioned Occupy Wall Street, and I don't know if they were a success or not. It became kind of complicated in the end, but we still talk about the 1%. That's something that they framed, and that's actually there.
I think Occupy was a success to a great degree, actually, in really altering the discourse, and that's what we're talking about. And actually, when the discourse can alter, then there are so many more possibilities for us to get the sorts of points we're trying to get across. So it wasn't an immediate success, but actually that was huge, and it's ongoing.
Yeah. And the 1% is something we still talk about, and it is the 1% who are now the Pandora Papers are showing the faces of. And the people who are helping the 1%, the enablers, the wealth management people in London and other places. So I think it helps us a little bit to look sharper on this.
Yeah, and I think there are links right to our most recent big success that the world has seen, which is Berlin. I mean, they have really been able to harness the David and Goliath 1% versus the monopoly of Vonovia and Deutsche Wohnen and others successfully, with a solution attached to their banner, right? They just weren't just saying, this is unfair, unjust. They're saying, and we're going to right this, we're going to correct it, and this is how. And they managed to mobilize more than 1 million voters in their favor. So I do think this is a sort of cumulative thing that's happening over time. I mean, that's how change happens anyway. Nothing happens overnight. It's a cumulative. So maybe we date it to Occupy Wall Street. I don't know where we date it from, but I actually find it amazing within my own sector. What is my sector? I don't know exactly, but human rights, housing, how slow we've been to sort of galvanize around this and try to move forward. When I became rapporteur, the housing groups themselves were not talking about this. It's surprising, right? Like, who do you expect to talk about this? You would think the housing groups would, but...
And you, Leilani, your work has had an extreme impact. What we now hear is activists all over the world using the right framing. Housing is a human right. And we didn't hear this before because it was this market all the time. And you actually, by being so sharp in language, helped people to fight back. And I think this is a huge step. And I think what Anna is talking about here is also the same. We have to reframe.
I think that's right. Well, and I think, authors like Anna, David Madden, who wrote In Defense of Housing, Richard Florida, who actually did a whole, I don't know if people know who he is. He's an urban planner academic. He did a mea culpa because he felt he had actually contributed to the kind of financialization of housing in a way. A lot of people are landing that in a place where radical reform is required, and human rights does offer that. So, I think I'm lucky in that I happen to be a human rights advocate, but it's the framework itself that I think people find very appealing, because what's it about, really? It's about the kind of societies, Fredrik, you talk about so eloquently, the kind of societies we want to live in. Like, don't we want, as Fredrik would say, here's my Fredrik voice, don't we want people to be happy? Don't we want to live in peaceful societies with social inclusion? Okay, you don't say that, but
is that me?
Yeah,
okay.
No, you do, right? You're very good at
smile.
That's right. But that's what human rights is about. That's all it's about, is social inclusion, more equal societies, less inequality, more dignity for everyone, for people who are just playing by the rules. They go to school, they get a job, they should have a good life.
Yeah, just to sort of come in on that and to say, I think also, Leilani, what you actually have offered is a big picture view as well. Human rights is a really important framing, but, you were able to sort of draw it together in a big picture view. And I think the real difficulty that housing activists have is that they're so disparate, and they're so tied into local struggles. And it's really, really valuable to be able to sort of draw it all together. And, human rights is one aspect. Another aspect which just came to mind, actually, as you were talking about Berlin and the successes in Berlin, which actually have been rooted in drawing it together with the public interest in legislation, in Berlin's post-war legislation, and therefore actually what the activists are asking for has a legal basis in law. And around the world, the public interest actually has played that role in so many post-war legislative frameworks. And I wonder if alongside the human rights framing, we can try to find a way of actually allowing that public interest discourse to come back in as well.
I think what is actually happened now in many places is that people go out on the streets and they fight with tear gas, and all this. And what they ask for is a new constitution, a better legislation. In Chile, that's like one of the most interesting things cooking right now, where they elected a new assembly to create a new constitution. And it's so now everybody is talking about how should we run this country? What should the rules be?
Yeah, I think that's the winning combination, frankly. And I think that legislative piece is fundamental, because it's so much more difficult to dismantle legislation than it is to dismantle a policy or just some program or something like that. I would say the bulk of what I get asked these days, especially very recently, is to talk about the role of legislation. What would the right to housing look like in legislation? Does it have to be in a constitution? Can it just be a kind of legislated right to housing? All sorts of, I'm quite surprised and very happy for this. And it is activists, grassroots activists mobilizing, who are thinking, okay, how can we how can we really make change here? What would structural change actually look like? I mean, I get it from others as well. National human rights institutions, most countries have them. I'm starting to get quite a few requests. New Zealand is on a big housing inquiry. The Human Rights Commission there is on a big housing inquiry, and they're looking at legislation. So I'm really starting to feel this. Spain, of course, has been in discussion for a long time, many countries. And of course, we look to the South Africans who use legislation, their beautiful, beautiful constitution, which enshrines the right to housing and many other social and economic rights. The activists, it's just how they do activism. They always use legislation. It's pretty cool.
And I know you have a meeting you have to run to. So do you want to send some final words out to us and to the listeners?
Yeah, I mean, I think sort of the biggest point that I want to make, and, you know, I've been thinking about it a lot, and actually, Leilani, what we were talking about last week as well in the meeting, you know, it's really around discourse and language and the creation of a common sense. And we have a common sense in the UK, which we've had now, you know, for the last generation around housing. And it has begun to be chipped away at. And that's a really, really positive thing. And, you know, as awful and as tragic a seismic event like Grenfell was, actually, that really started to undermine that common sense. So we are in quite a good place to reframe the whole debate around housing. And associated with that, we have to reframe the whole debate around offshore money laundering, tax havens. It's not about offshore and shell companies and tax. It is, as you say, Fredrik, about a social contract and having a society which operates, you know, with a proper constitution. Well, Britain getting a proper constitution is another matter, but, you know, it's about having a society which really, you know, is underpinned by a social contract.
So that was Anna Minton. And she ends up and say that we need to reframe the whole debate around housing. Well, that's something you are doing with your human rights directives, Leilani?
Yeah, but she goes further, right? She says that we actually need to move away from just trying to look at tax and finance and island nations where money is being stored offshore, and actually look at the social contract and whatever happened to the social contract, which I think, Fredrik, is something that you've been interested in for a long time now.
I am interested in the social contract because the social contract is nothing that is written, but it's kind of deeply in our bodies in some way. It's like the rules we follow to be able to be part of a society. And that's something we also teach our kids, you know, work hard, study hard, be good citizens, and there will be a chance for you. And then people quite often see the guys driving by in the very expensive cars are the ones who have been breaking the rules. So and that, I think that provocation is it's something that many people see around the world and feel, and that makes them really, really angry.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's worse, right? Because it's the guys driving around in those luxury vehicles who are breaking the rules, but it's governments that are enabling them. And I think people are really angry at their governments for letting it go or supporting it in some cases.
Yeah, and we could see that, I mean, Trump was lowering the taxes for the richest in the world. And you have seen a lot of tax incentives going towards these real estate investment trusts. I mean, the worst speculators are actually giving tax incentives.
Exactly. It's enough to make people pretty angry.
Yeah, and people's anger takes many directions. Some of them are really sad and xenophobic and so on. And others are more constructive, but still, I mean, it's you can understand why people are so angry.
Mm-hmm. And it's, you know, Fredrik, it is related, of course, to human rights. Yeah. I mean, that's the point of human rights, is to keep governments in check so that they don't allow this stuff to happen, so that people can have access to healthcare and education and housing and etc. Right? So.
Yeah. So, friends, if you heard about Pushback Talks, you can also help us out on supporting the podcast. Isn't that a great idea, Leilani?
It's wonderful. Absolutely. They can go to our Patreon account and become a Patreon.
You can be a Patreon. And if you haven't seen Push the Film, you can always find it on pushthefilm.com. And if you want to talk to me or Leilani, you can find us on Twitter and other platforms and just put us a question. We are there under our own names, no secret funny things. We are actually very straightforward people, honest with big hearts and funny hairdos.
Speak for yourself.
Yeah, I know. Mine is a little bit crazy. I'm actually going to the hairdresser on Saturday before I go to France.
Oh.
I'm going to France to a documentary film conference where I'm going to meet a lot of European broadcasters that hopefully will be supporting my new film project.
Excellent.
It's a hassle, but the hassle is happening then in La Rochelle, France. So it
could be worse.
It can be worse.
Yes. Well, good luck with that, Fredrik. I hope you get lots of support for your new film.
Thank you. Yes, I need it. So, and this autumn coming up, we should talk more about your human rights directives, but we can also start talking a little bit more about my new film.
Fantastic. Happy to do that.
Okay, that's good. Because we are the filmmaker and the advocates.
We are.
So have a great day. Dive into the blue.
Happy summer.
Happy summer. Ciao.